Chapter 9. In the Aftermath of Tiananmen. One immediate side effect of the tragedy of Tiananmen was that for the first time, a large segment of the Chinese population, especially the many intellectuals and dissidents who had escaped China after the crackdown, began to have more empathy for the plight of the Tibetan people. In the years following 1989, I have had many meetings with Chinese involved in the pro-democracy movement who had fled to the outside world. Paris, London, Switzerland, Germany, the United States, Canada, Australia, and Japan as well. Several key members of the Tiananmen Square protest movement formed an organization in Paris in September 1989 called the Federation for Democratic China, FDC. At their request, I had a moving meeting with their leadership in Paris in December 1989. Among the dissidents I met was Yan Jiaqi, once a political advisor to the Chinese Premier Zhao Ziyang, and later a prominent advocate for a democratic China. I applauded them for their courage and commitment to bringing greater democracy in China. Given the size of China's population, the mission of a democratic China is truly a noble work, and they need perseverance and unflagging determination if they are to succeed. I shared with them our own struggle for Tibetan freedom and dignity, and said that we would remain undaunted and totally committed to our cause, no matter how long it might take. I took the opportunity to stress to them that with respect to our own struggle, we made the decision to pursue the middle way approach to not seek independence, rather to seek genuine autonomy that would enable us to survive and thrive as a people with our own distinct language, culture, and religion. I reminded them that in comparison to our struggle for freedom, their struggle for a democratic China had only just begun. Later, I also met other senior figures among Chinese dissidents, including especially Wei Jingsheng, the well-known human rights activist famed for his 1978 essay, The Fifth Modernization, posted on the Democracy Wall in Beijing, and Harry Wu, who was instrumental in exposing the horrors of China's Gulag system. The latter, in fact, urged me on a few occasions to reconsider my stance and instead campaign for the full independence of Tibet. In 1991, at a conference on human rights at Columbia University in New York, I had the honor to share the platform with the distinguished Chinese astrophysicist Fang Lizhi, who by then had also been living in exile. I met the remarkable Chinese writer Wang Ruowang as well, who famously wrote a letter to Deng Xiaoping supporting the student-led demonstrations at Tiananmen and helped lead a march to the Shanghai City Hall. What these great Chinese intellectuals, as well as the hundreds of student leaders who fled China in the wake of Tiananmen were fighting for, was greater freedom, dignity, and democracy in China. Regardless of how they were portrayed by the Communist Party, all of these individuals who paid a heavy personal price for their conscience were true patriots that cared deeply for the future of China and its place in the world. I have always maintained that our struggle is not against the Chinese people, but against an oppressive regime and for the rights of the Tibetan people. So, logically, I have deep empathy for others oppressed by the communist Chinese regime, which include the Chinese people themselves, the Mongols of Inner Mongolia, and the Uyghur people of East Turkestan, Xinjiang. I have met with a number of Uyghurs in exile, notably Isa Altekin and his son Erkin Altekin, and later Rabia Kadir and Dolkun Isa, respectively, the former and current presidents of the World Uyghur Congress. I shared with them the importance of embracing strict non-violence in one just struggle for freedom, and my enduring belief that only through non-violence and consideration of the needs and concerns of both sides can there be a truly lasting solution to any conflict. And adopting an approach that is mutually beneficial is key to finding solutions through the non-violence method. Speaking to them about our own Tibetan struggle, I repeated what I often tell our supporters in the international community, that I consider them neither anti-Chinese nor pro-Tibetan, but pro-freedom and pro-truth. The awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to me in October 1989 and the subsequent ceremony in Oslo brought extensive international attention to the Tibetan cause. For Tibetans across the world, this prize was an important recognition of our steadfast commitment to a non-violent struggle to regain our freedom and dignity. For me personally, one of the most moving aspects of the experience was to see the joyful and celebratory faces of so many Tibetans and our international supporters who have worked tirelessly over decades. To this day, I remember vividly the beautiful and joyful energy of the presence of so many who had come to Oslo to be part of the celebration. I took the opportunity to thank many of them in person. Back home in Tibet too, I learned that many Tibetans celebrated, despite the obvious dangers they faced for doing such a thing. If anything, the situation inside continued to worsen. In July 1990, the Chinese Communist Party leader Jiang Zemin and the head of the People's Liberation Army, General Staff Department Chi Haotian, visited Tibet. By now, as in China, a much more hardline faction was in control in Tibet. The Chinese authorities emphasized loyalty to the motherland and the struggle against splitism. That is, the struggle against me and the exiled community. They greatly increased incentives for Chinese migration into Tibet, such that a newly arrived worker from China stood to gain a substantial increase in salary. This growing migration caused much resentment among the Tibetans, including Tibetan Communist Party cadres. This hardening inside Tibet was such a sad and strange development in comparison to what was happening in the wider world. For this was the period when the tide of freedom was sweeping across the world, including the ending of dictatorships in the Philippines in 1986 and in Chile in 1990, and of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. It was also a moment of genuine détente and significant nuclear disarmament between the Soviet Union and the United States. Yet, in China, and in Tibet especially, this was the beginning of a new era of repression. My own efforts for seeking a solution through dialogue continually hit a wall of rejection. On the international front, in May 1991, the U.S. legislature passed a congressional concurrent resolution recognizing Tibet as an illegally occupied country and reaffirmed the United States' position on Tibet, as stated by the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in 1961, which is that the United States believes its objectives must include the restoration of human rights of the Tibetan people and their natural right of self-determination. The resolution concluded, "It is the sense of the Congress that Tibet, including those areas incorporated into the Chinese provinces of Sichuan, Yunnan, Gansu, and Qinghai, is an occupied country under established principles of international law whose true representatives are the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile, as recognized by the Tibetan people." A few years later, in 1997, the U.S. government established the Office of the U.S. Special Coordinator for Tibetan Issues within the State Department. Today, this office coordinates the U.S. policies and programs related to Tibetan issues in accord with the Tibetan Policy Act of 2002, which was amended with the Tibetan Policy and Support Act of 2020. I have had the pleasure to meet with every holder of the position since its inception. Deeply concerned by the worsening situation inside Tibet in 1991, and in particular China's outlier status as an active agent of repression, that year I accepted an invitation to speak at Yale University. I began by recognizing the momentous era we were living through, and how the world had changed dramatically in the last few years. I reflected on how the fall of the Berlin Wall and the Soviet Union after 70 years of communist control signaled the aspirations of people and nations for freedom and democracy. I spoke of how I felt deeply inspired during my recent visits to Mongolia and the Baltic states and Bulgaria, seeing millions of human beings enjoying the freedom they had been denied for so many decades. I particularly noted how this amazing transition took place without resorting to violence, emphasizing the need for the international community to continue to engage with China. I said that I was a firm believer that relations between people and between nations must be based on human understanding. The world should engage China whenever it is willing to take part in the international community in a constructive manner. But when it persists in violating fundamental norms of civilized behavior, it should not be indulged like a spoiled child. China must be made accountable for its actions as a responsible member of the international community. With respect to our ongoing attempt to negotiate with China, I observed that the Chinese government's refusal to reciprocate my efforts to start negotiations had increased the impatience of many Tibetans inside Tibet, especially among the youth, with the non-violent path we were following. Tension was increasing as China encouraged demographic aggression in Tibet, threatening to reduce Tibetans to a second-class minority in our own country. I was extremely anxious that, in this explosive situation, violence could break out. I said that I wanted to do what I could to help prevent this. I then expressed my wish to be able to visit Tibet so I could communicate directly with my people and urge them not to abandon our path of nonviolence. My visit would offer the possibility for the senior Chinese leadership to understand the true feelings of the Tibetan people. Since there had been no constructive response from Beijing to both my 5-point peace plan and the subsequent Strasbourg proposal of 1988, in September 1991, I stated that I no longer considered myself bound by them, yet I stressed that we remained fully committed to the path of negotiation. Of course, we continued with our efforts to keep lines of communication open with China. When in December 1991, the Chinese Premier Li Peng visited Delhi, I sought unsuccessfully to meet with him. In June 1992, my brother Gyalo Tondup met Ding Guangan, a Politburo member, who carried a message from the Chinese government offering resumption of dialogue on the condition that I publicly renounce the idea of Tibetan independence. This was odd, since we had already stated unequivocally and repeatedly that we were willing to cease our demand for independence as part of a negotiated settlement. Nonetheless, on September 11th, 1992, I wrote formally to both the paramount leader, Deng Xiaoping, and General Secretary Jiang Zemin. I expressed my openness to talks, and by way of setting things in a broader context, included a supplemental note summarizing the history of our conversations thus far, since 1951. The letter was delivered to the Chinese ambassador in Delhi, alongside a suggestion for regular monthly meetings at the Chinese embassy to build confidence. However, it took until July 1993 before the Chinese government allowed my representatives to present this letter in person. The letter, addressed to Jiang Zemin, conveyed my basic belief in the process of negotiation as the only viable means to solve the issue of Tibet. I wrote, "I am pleased that direct contact has once again been established between us. I hope that this will lead to an improvement of relations and the development of mutual understanding and trust. I have been informed of the discussions Mr. Ding Guangan had with Gyalo Thondup on June 22, 1992, and the position of the government of China concerning negotiations for a solution to the Tibetan question. I am disappointed with the hard and inflexible position conveyed by Mr. Ding Guangan, particularly the emphasis on preconditions for negotiations. However, I remain committed to the belief that our problems can be solved only through negotiations, held in an atmosphere of sincerity and openness, for the benefit of both the Tibetan and Chinese people. To make this possible, neither side should put up obstacles, and neither side should, therefore, state preconditions. For meaningful negotiations to take place, it is essential to have mutual trust. Therefore, in order to create trust, I believe it is important for the leaders and people of China to know of the endeavors I have made so far. My 3 representatives carry with them a letter from me, accompanied by a detailed note of my views and my efforts through the years to promote negotiations in the best interests of the Tibetan and Chinese people. They will answer and discuss any questions and points you wish to raise. It is my hope that through these renewed discussions, we will find a way that will lead us to negotiations. On my part, I have put forward many ideas to solve our problem. I believe that it is now time for the Chinese government to make a genuinely meaningful proposal if you wish to see Tibet and China live together in peace. I therefore sincerely hope that you will respond in a spirit of openness and friendship. Accompanying this letter was a detailed note I prepared for the Chinese leadership outlining succinctly the history of my approach to the issue of Tibet and the thinking behind it, and my proposal for a discussion to move toward a substantive dialogue. In the conclusion of that note, I stated, "If China wants Tibet to stay with China, then China must create the necessary conditions for this. The time has come now for the Chinese to show the way for Tibet and China to live together in friendship." A detailed step-by-step outline regarding Tibet's basic status should be spelt out. If such a clear outline is given, regardless of the possibility of an agreement or not, we Tibetans can then make a decision whether to live with China or not. If we Tibetans obtain our basic rights to our satisfaction, then we are not incapable of seeing the possible advantages of living with the Chinese. I concluded with an expression of hope, saying that I trusted in the far-sightedness and wisdom of China's leaders and hoped that they would take into consideration the current global political changes and the need to resolve the Tibetan problem peacefully, promoting genuine, lasting friendship between our 2 peoples. In the meantime, the Chinese government published a white paper in September 1992 entitled Tibet, Its Ownership and Human Rights Situation. Misleadingly, the document dwells long on a history of Tibet presented as if it had always been part of China, indicating a defensiveness on the part of China's leadership on the legitimacy of China's presence in Tibet. The document presents a series of arguments against Tibetan independence, claiming that the so-called Tibetan independence, which the Dalai clique and overseas anti-China forces propagate, is nothing but a fiction of the imperialists who committed aggression against China in modern history. Shockingly, the document further asserts, another lie is the claim that a large number of Hans have migrated to Tibet, turning the ethnic Tibetans into a minority, flatly denying a fact acknowledged by every independent observer and recognized as a major source of resentment for the Tibetan people. Back home in Tibet, protests by more than 1,000 lay people erupted in Lhasa on May 23, 1993, initially over rising costs, but swiftly becoming about independence. These demonstrations resulted in brutal suppression and mass arrests. One of the causes was clearly the increasing influx of Chinese migrants into Lhasa. In 1994, when the Third Tibet Work Forum was convened by the party's Central Committee in Beijing, a set of new repressive policies was imposed. Among these was increased spending on security mechanisms of control and a newly vitriolic attack on me personally. For example, one of their official statements contained the allegation that, although sometimes Dalai speaks softly and says nice things to deceive the masses, he has never ceased his splittist activities. It then went on to assert, the focus point in our region's fight to oppose splittism is to oppose the Dalai clique. As the saying goes, to kill a serpent, we must first cut off its head. This same document then urged the monastic community inside Tibet to renounce the Dalai Lama. It stated that we must firmly stop the Dalai clique influencing lamas and nuns in Tibet in any way. The issuing of this statement was accompanied by a complete ban on any photographs or portraits of me, both in public spaces and private homes in Tibet. Effectively, a form of ideological indoctrination, especially in the area of education, that had not been seen since the Cultural Revolution was being imposed on Tibet. The party leadership in Lhasa asserted, ethnic education cannot be regarded successful if it successfully maintains the old culture and traditions. The essence of educational work is to cultivate qualified constructors and successors for the socialist cause. And this is the sole basic mission in ethnic education. Official statements such as this and the repressive policies on the ground targeting Tibetan identity, culture and traditions, as well as the large-scale demographic change taking place on the Tibetan plateau, caused me great alarm, compelling me to say that what was happening inside Tibet was either willingly or unwillingly a form of cultural genocide.